Thank you so much for joining us for the last session of the last day. We appreciate you sticking around. We are planning on having quite the interesting conversation. I think that throughout the conference, we've seen a lot of people talk about ethics, talk about regulation, talk about what we should do with the technology on a very, very high level. And this panel is going to be unique in the sense that it's going to take that conversation and actually apply it, and come up with a better idea of what we can actually do to make sure that we can uphold these kind of standards. So let's get started with our first question, and that is, what is responsible AI to you?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Nick Chapados. I am a co-founder and chief science officer at Element AI. So before the responsible AI answer, a quick word about what we do at Element. So we help large organizations transform their operations by running more and more on artificial intelligence. So we do this by delivering software products and systems that help upgrade the quality of decisions all across the organization. So I like to say that we are like a 2-year-old toddler that grew very, very quickly. When we launched the company 2 years ago, we were 8 people. We're now today more than 425 in 5 locations around the world, including our hometown of Montreal in Canada, Toronto, London, UK, Seoul, South Korea, as well as here in Singapore. So one way to look at AI is that it's like a new way of writing software. If we look at the old-fashioned way of writing software, you would pound millions of lines of code into a system. You would codify business rules in a very, very detailed fashion. Whereas with AI, we can move a lot of that code into a training set or into a simulation environment that provides the right kind of signals for the machine to learn. So this has a lot of benefits. Of course, we get much, much quicker feedback loops about whether the system works or not. We can go from a system where we can make changes in a scale of months to years, down to making changes on a scale of weeks to days. But of course, with this much, much faster feedback, things can go wrong also at a very, very fast speed. Of course, the concerns of data governance remain in the world of AI. So things like data quality, integrity, security, all of that remains. But AI governance should go even further. AI governance should really worry about how signals are extracted from the data, how signals are extracted from the noise, essentially, and turned into outcomes. And then are those outcomes beneficial to the organization, but to other stakeholders and to users in general? So I think AI governance should really focus on 3 different things. First of all, what is it that we are doing? What is the intent of the system? And is this intent made clear and explicit? Second, we should really monitor and orchestrate the right feedback mechanisms to make sure that these do not go out of hand. And finally, the third point is really about getting an assessment of the risks. What are all the ways in which the things can go wrong? Can we implement some self-monitoring procedures in the system, or do we have people that watch over things that can go wrong? So I'll stop here and let my other panelists continue.
Thanks very much. So my name is McWaters. I'm the Financial Innovation Lead at the World Economic Forum, organization probably best known for our annual meeting in Davos. And my area of work really focuses on bringing together incumbents, innovators, regulators, and academics to understand the direction of the future of financial services. And so the last year, we've been really focused on understanding the implications of AI, and recently launched a paper called The New Physics of Financial Services, because I think we're seeing a really rapid and significant transformation of the way in which financial services works in response to the capabilities offered by AI. And in the context of what does that mean for responsible AI, I think it's a little bit interesting because in the midst of that enormous change, it can be tempting to imagine that everything's changing and that we need to think about responsibility really as something that starts from square one. But I think fundamentally the role of financial services is still the same. It's about allocating capital. It's about facilitating savings and payments. It's about helping offer a more inclusive financial system. And I think that when we think about responsible AI, it's really about how figuring out what the new mechanisms, the new regulations, the new governance protocols are that are going to enable us to take financial services to the next level, to make it fairer, more inclusive, safer, and more stable, rather than having it turn the other way around.
Thanks. So my name is Shameek Kundu. I'm Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered Bank. Unlike your organization, unfortunately, we are, or fortunately perhaps, more than 150 years old. We are a bank of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and our focus is firmly on these markets. For my sins, I'm also a member of the MAS Committee on Responsible AI, the one that got announced 2 days ago. So instead of trying to answer what is responsible AI, and by the way, both the answers sound correct, maybe I'm going to try and be a bit disruptive. What is irresponsible AI, right? Because I think that's easier to answer than what's responsible. Irresponsible AI is to select or choose to use AI in an area that is not yet ready. For example, our head of financial crime, John Cusack, he often goes public with his concerns that actually there isn't enough data, historic data, reliable data, for AI algorithms to model all kinds of financial crime yet. So to purely depend on that would be unwise on his part. He does use it for specific areas, but not across the board. So that would be irresponsible. Being a senior manager in a bank and saying, sorry, Gov, the machine did it, I don't know what happened, that is irresponsible. It doesn't matter if the machine did it, if you bought the machine from Element AI or Silent 8 or anybody else, it's your problem. That is irresponsible. Clearly, letting the AI algorithm enhance or worsen the bias that we might already have. For example, choosing to perhaps not lend to Malays as a community in Singapore, that would be wrong, right? But equally, even if factually the algorithm is not biased, it might be wrong to make decisions that are factually correct but are not consistent with the ethical expectations that you have for your company, that society has from you, right? And this is a particular problem, of course, in insurance, where it might be wise to not cover certain people, but you might still not want to do it. So all of these things are irresponsible. But I'd like to finish this answer with one other thing. It is also irresponsible in an industry that fails to cover 1.7 billion people. It is also irresponsible to not use AI when it can help you improve financial inclusion, when it can make it much safer for actually banks doesn't matter. As humanity and as society, as geographies, particularly for us as a bank, if our purpose is to promote commerce and prosperity in Asia, Africa, and Middle East, not using AI when it can enable that is also irresponsible. Yep.
Well said. Okay, now we'll move to our second question, and that relates to you in the context of being a part of a world-leading company implementing AI in various sectors. How would you implement AI responsibly? How would you go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, Shameek, to your point, all the AIs that we deliver is explainable, right? So we can give to Gov the explanation for why specific decisions were made. So of course, I'm super excited about the potential for AI to transform organizations and really to augment intelligence of individuals and organizations so that they can make better decisions all across. If we look at the way traditional data analytics is done, for example, it's really about answering singular questions. It's really about making predictions about single aspects of a business process. So that a phone company, for example, would want to predict whether you're going to pay your bill this month or if you're going to go to a competitor. But with AI, we're now in a position to build representations of business objects that are really predictive of the entire behavior of that individual across all aspects of the organization. So that a phone company could be able to see if you're a happy or a unhappy customer, and it could also try to compute what is the shortest path in terms of business actions to turning you from an unhappy customer into a happy customer. So this is great power. This lets us do things and think about things that we could not do before. But as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. And one of the things that we must think about in terms of AI governance, I think really falls upon four different aspects or four different buckets. The first one is a measure of performance. Are we delivering in the AI model the level of accuracy and performance that we would expect from it? And this is closely related to notions of bias. Is the model systematically discriminating against identifiable subgroups in the population? And perhaps less obviously, the third component of performance is really about, have we put in the training set or the training environment a broadly encompassing subset of all the situations that the model will encounter in the future. So in other words, is the training set representative of what is going to happen when the model is going to be deployed in the field? So that's the subject of performance, and it's a really important one, but of course it's not the only one. The other aspects that are of importance is the question of security. One aspect that's been studied a lot in the machine learning community over the past few years is what is known as adversarial attacks. So those are specifically crafted inputs that we give to a model in order to fool its behavior, in order to cause the model to misbehave. So the counter to that is, are we robust to those adversarial examples? Then there is a question of privacy. What kind of IP are we capturing when we train model on specific data sets? And are the users that are being impacted by this privacy leak, are they made aware that this is happening? And the final aspect really is what can fall under the umbrella of transparency. Are the models transparent? That includes a condition of explainability, so being able to give explanations for what's going on. But to my mind, it also very importantly includes a notion of intent. When we train a machine learning model or an AI system more broadly, we are implicitly optimizing for certain conditions. The system is trying to maximize some certain objective function, and this corresponds to an implicit intent about the purpose of that model. Now, are the users that are going to be impacted by those models fully aware of the intent that is implicit in that model? To me, this is a key part of transparency, and it's part of implementing responsible AI governance.
Okay, thank you for that. We move on to the second question to you, Shameek. How are we already using AI responsibly in the financial industry, and how are we using it irresponsibly, following your point?
Hopefully we at least aren't using it irresponsibly. I'll probably not try and answer for the entire industry, because as the sessions in the last 3 days would have told you, the industry is in various different places. I mean, Jessica talking about how she uses or her team uses AI would be very different from how we use it. But talking from our perspective, first of all, perhaps it's useful to say where we are using it. And as I kind of hinted earlier, the primary use cases of AI so far for us has not yet been so much at the customer interface. I mean, there's the rather glib saying that AI is the new UI. It might well be, but if you ask us, are the biggest single challenges that we can crack with AI today about improving the customer interface for our existing customers? Probably not. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that we can solve. The biggest single impact we can have is fundamentally banking is about managing risks. It's about working safely and serving customers safely, keeping their trust, not allowing financial crime, not impacting market stability, etc. And to do that, I'm not sure our good friend David is here, so I'll say that to do that, regulators like the MAS put constraints around us, rightly so, to make sure that we are worthy of that trust, so to say. What AI has been allowing us to do and where we've been using it is to expand that safe space in which we can operate and expand who we serve. So it's not been so much on what products we offer or how we offer, it's been much more on who we can reach, how much more we can reach using AI. So examples have been around using AI, machine learning for automating some kinds of compliance processes, both in financial crime and surveillance. They've been around using it to change how we lend, particularly to small businesses in areas where we have a lot of data available. They've been around optimizing how we keep our liquidity buffers and how we calculate them so that, again, we can make use more of that capital. And there's been a lot around what you typically call back and middle office. So for us, a lot of the early use of AI has been around that space of enabling rather than on the customer interface directly. Now, how have we been going about it responsibly? To put it bluntly, there are many disadvantages of being a 150-year-old bank. One of the advantages is that it's very difficult to do anything without being relatively cautious. So I would say in these early stages, how do we use AI responsibly? We're incredibly selective about where we allow AI to actually go into production. That's number one, right? So when I gave that financial crime example, John wouldn't allow us to use it to replace algorithms for AML, but he would be okay allowing us to use it to semi-automate the investigation process, as an example. So we're quite clear about where, at this point, our risk appetite allows us to adopt it and where it doesn't. The second thing is that actually, in terms of the actual production use cases, at the moment, it's still largely human remediated. So it's not entirely straight through AI in most of the production use cases, at least for us. Again, this might not be true across the board. Will that be sustainable? No. But at the moment, there is a human in the loop in many cases, which means that we're still relatively comfortable. But in the long term, though, I think where we can go with this is that many of the things that you just talked about, Nick, for example, banks haven't been doing AI for donkey's years, but they have been looking at data quality for at least a decade since Basel II days. They have been looking at model risk management for at least 2 decades to calculate risk and liquidity models, for example. They have absolutely been obsessed with maybe not all aspects of data privacy, but certainly financial data by its very definition. We are meant to be trustees. So a lot of the framework that is needed to adhere to responsible AI is present. It's not built for AI. AI is a very different scale. I mean, governing a model that is based on traditional statistical methods is very different from trying to explain a machine learning algorithm, but the baseline exists. So what we're trying to do is to see how we can adapt some of the framework that we already have for existing assurance to try and use it for doing AI responsibly. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Jesse, now I turn to you to really talk about the future and where we see AI being applied responsibly. Where does that lead us in the future, and what do you see kind of going forward?
Sure. So I think that for me, I want to think about this in terms of 3 opportunities of how I think the financial services ecosystem could be characterized differently in the future. But each of those opportunities comes with a commensurate regulatory and governance challenge. And for me, the 3 are that I think the future under AI has more and better advice. It has improved decisioning and customization. And finally, it's more specialized and interconnected. So first, let me talk about advice. So I think it's evident to most of the folks in this room that most individuals, particularly in the mass market, but even in sort of mass affluent markets, have a deficit of advice. And that's because advice has traditionally come at a significant cost. A human cost, and humans aren't scalable. AI is increasingly allowing us to provide advisory that is effectively zero marginal cost, that is delivered in real time, that can be parceled out into behaviorally tailored nudges, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that has a huge opportunity to improve, in a sense, the financial inclusion, the financial sophistication, to improve the financial outcomes of individuals. And not just individuals. Think of small businesses. The majority of small business bankruptcies are driven by liquidity challenges. That's because they're specialized and focused on running their small business, not on being an accounting and liquidity expert. But if you're going to be delivering advice via AI, you have to ask yourself, how do we know that that advice is good, right? And so you talked about the fact that you're targeting an objective function with these. What is that objective function? How do we ensure that it's not inappropriately biased? How do we also put the right governance structures in place to make sure that the AI doesn't learn unintended or poor activity? We've already seen in retail cases around sort of buying and selling goods and services, instances of pricing bots learning to collude with one another. You know, that's an antitrust challenge that no financial institution wants. But it's also that from a compliance perspective, we aren't used to thinking about AI scale, right? Like if you've got a bad advisor who's giving people bad advice, you fire the advisor, you pay the fine, you make the person whole, it's at a micro scale that's manageable. But suddenly you scale that up to a huge code base and the risks to the organization and to its customers are enormous. Second, better decisions. And I think we've already talked about this a fair bit, but whether it's insurance, credit, or picking stocks, there's an opportunity for AI to help us include a greater range of factors and get better outcomes. That has significant opportunities to, for example, include thin file individuals who don't have extensive credit data, or individuals who have made a really significant behavioral change, turned the corner in terms of how they run their financial lives, making sure those people have access to capital. But it's also got an ugly side to it. If we're not careful, we know that it can have disparate impact, it can have ethical challenges. We also have to think that just because we've gotten more accurate doesn't mean that there aren't people who will still need insurance. So there might be a requirement for us to re-explore the line between public and private responsibility in those cases, to have some pretty philosophical discussions about how we manage that. And then finally, I think we're driving, by virtue of our pursuit of AI, to a world that is more interconnected and more specialized. AI is an environment that rewards first movers who are able to set up virtuous data loops. And those virtuous data loops lead to scale offerings. So no bank is going to build on their own a visual, a machine vision program to rival that of Google's. They're simply not going to have access to that type of scale of data. So you're going to need more and more integration into third-party providers. And with that comes some challenges in terms of predicting and understanding operational risk. It creates challenges around the systemic stability and prudential considerations of the system. Not that we can't manage those. We've been managing operational risk brought on by new technology for decades. But in an environment where regulatory priorities are diverging, particularly around data standards and data portability requirements, I think it becomes significantly more challenging than it has been in the past.
Right. So now that you're comfortably settled in your respective expertise, we're going to shuffle the cards a little bit. And the next question that we're going to ask is, what areas do you draw on for inspiration when you think about responsible AI? And I'm going to take two birds with one stone. One is I'm going to give you some time to think about it, and I will answer the question first. And second, I've been reading a lot of your comments and a lot of your questions, and I think that the answer I'm going to give is going to address probably most of them. one of the things that I draw on for inspiration when I think about responsible AI is called the automation paradox. And the automation paradox basically says that the more competent a machine is, a system is, the more competent the human operator has to be in order to manage it. And that means responsible AI. It means that the operator and the person behind it needs to be responsible, because AI does not assume responsibility. We're not at that level. I think all of us can agree that it's not yet developed to the extent that AI can say, oh, yeah, my bad. Sorry, I did that. The automation paradox basically creates 3 problems that we should probably discuss when thinking about applying AI responsibly. First, a really, really good system corrects our errors automatically. We make a lot of mistakes and we actually don't even notice that we're making it, because the machine picks up on them and fixes it for us. And that means that we are used to making mistakes. We don't even judge our own work because of that. Second is that it doesn't really allow us a lot of time to practice things that we would have practiced before. If you think about, for example, calculating, a calculator can crunch numbers faster than any of you can. And we can make a competition. Unless you're a math genius, then congratulations to you. The problem that creates is that even if you're really, really good at math, you don't get to practice it because it doesn't make sense to you. It's much easier and much more accurate to go for the calculator, and therefore even people who are very, very competent get out of practice. They don't get the chance to practice. And then third, the problem that this creates, and that's really when the aspect of responsibility comes through, is that when the machine does fail, when something does go wrong, it requires an immense amount of competence to make up for it, because you need to do 2 things. One, you need to be able to replace the machine, and you need to do just as good, or I would say even better, and you need to understand what went wrong, and you need to understand how to fix it. And that kind of gives us another kind of burden to carry, because now we need to be really good at what we do, and we actually need to understand what the machine does. And most operators don't get that. So if there's one thing that from my end I would like you to take home with you about responsible AI, is that we need to make sure that in order to be able to use AI responsibly, we invest more in operators and human capital and not less. We can't replace, we can't substitute. The better the machines get, the better we should become, because we need to be able to handle both the human and the machine aspect of it. And with that said, who's willing to take the bait?
I'm happy to start. I like to draw inspiration from 2 fields where the cost of failure is very high. And those 2 fields, on the one hand, are the field of medical research, and the second one is closer to home. It's the field of accounting, quite a bit unexpectedly. So in the field of medical research, the way that drugs are approved today, if you're a US-based pharma, you need to convince the FDA that your drug satisfies 2 criteria. The first one is called the safety criterion. So is the drug going to kill you or not? And the second is the efficacy criterion. So is the drug doing what it says on the label that it should be doing? For medical devices, we have the same type of criteria, but devices themselves are classified according to how much harm they can cause you. So what is the materiality of the damage it can cause to your body, whether it's a simple wearable that you're just putting on your body, maybe not too much damage is possible, up to a prosthesis that if it's implanted in you and things go wrong, you can die from it. So the level of scrutiny there is much, much higher. And there is a whole codified procedure of review that goes along the potential for damage that can happen. The same broad field also has instituted the practice of systematic ethical review. So if you're a clinical researcher, you're a doctor working in a hospital, and you want to do research for some compound on human subjects, for example, you have to submit a detailed experimental plan and proposal to your institution's review board that will evaluate whether you should be allowed to proceed with it or not. So there is a whole institutional concern across all the biomedical research about the ways in which humans can be impacted by research activities. And this really has given rise to the field of bioethics, from which I think the field of AI ethics can learn a lot from. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, one aspect that I think is quite interesting is the way the accounting profession has evolved. If you think about it, accountants are highly trained professionals that spend years in school developing the skills and the judgment to evaluate the financial condition of companies. And since the middle of the 20th century, governments are forcing companies and organizations to hire those professionals to audit their financial books. So we get these independent professionals that are passing opinion on the financial, the dollars and cents status of organizations. Why cannot we have that for the bits that are inside organizations? Can't we have an independent evaluation, an independent audit of the state of models and the use of best practices for models that are making fully automated or semi-automated decisions that impact end users and that impact people with a huge degree of information asymmetry that do not have the power to really understand what's going on and to have recourse about the potential decisions that are made. So I think those, this could be one other area to take away, is to have this notion of independent data auditors that could be mandated in situations where decisions are made in cases of high information asymmetry.
All right. With your permission, I'm going to venture into dangerous territory here, and I'm going to practice philosophy without a license. Because I think there's a sense in which it's worth thinking about the philosophy of mind and what I think are some mistakes that we tend to intuitively make when we think about AI. And they're articulated much better than I'll be able to in the next minute in a paper called The 7 Deadly Sins of Predicting AI. And I think that for me, one of the most common ones when I talk with people is that there is a tendency to assume that which is easy for us is easy for the machine, and that which is hard for us is hard for the machine. And so we look at machine intelligences excelling at things that we might find very difficult, like winning a game of Go or chess or identifying images at speed, and we would assume that you can then fill in the blanks and that the intelligence would be able to do all manner of other things that we find very easy. Take image recognition. We can train an AI to have machine vision around identifying a cat or identifying a jaguar that is much more accurate, actually, than a human being. But then if you told the AI, oh, we also want you to look through the set for ocelots, they're kind of like something between a cat and a jaguar. A 5-year-old child would be able to figure that out. But the AI is remarkably ineffective at doing that. And what does this mean for financial services? It means that when we think about putting effective governance in place, we have to step back and understand the different gradient, if you will, for how the AI articulates itself and the sort of things that it finds hard, the type of incredibly stupid, from our perspective, mistakes it will make versus those that we would make. And we need to incorporate that understanding of the different capabilities, the complementary capabilities of the human and AI into the way that we govern each of those parties to deliver an effective financial system.
Thanks. I'll not venture into philosophy. I'll probably respond to your both examples, Nick, and perhaps a bit of the automation paradox. Actually, the traditional banks do have the accounting bit that you mentioned. So there are teams that do look at data and algorithms internally. There are teams at regulators that do that. There's a whole new industry on the sidelines of consulting that actually looks at that. So there is some precedent for that. In fact, in my organizations, my role somewhat is to do audits like that to understand. The challenge with that is it works when you're testing one anti-money laundering algorithm that could get us 300 million in fines, or one risk calculation model that will change how much capital we hold. It is difficult to extend when so much in the organization starts becoming AI driven. So when the lady in HR or the gentleman in communications is using AI to make decisions, first of all, forget doing the audit. It might not even be material in all those instances to do it. So I think where I would want to learn more from other industries, as I was thinking about the automation paradox, is actually cultural rather than technical. Because let's face it, as difficult as it is to be a banker, nobody dies typically if we make mistakes or if our AI makes mistakes. That is not the case if you are Boeing manufacturing the slightly faulty 737 MAX. And that is certainly not the case if you are a healthcare professional making decisions on the basis of an algorithm. What I'd like us as banks to learn is how do you build that culture where, in our case, 87,000 people who used to think their job is to make human decisions and to provide the human edge to banking. How do you make them comfortable to work with machines? And maybe it's not that all 80,000 people, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 50, I don't know how many. But everyone who continues to work needs to develop that ability to think about the risk it poses, and it differs based on materiality. And they need to learn how to work. Just in the same way that I'm told that airline pilots and airlines generally have a philosophy of sharing mistakes rather than hiding them. How do we get our staff to start thinking that that's how you work with algorithms? I think if we can make that cultural learning from other industries, I think that would be pretty good.
If I can add one comment here, to me it echoes a lot the way that many engineering professions developed. You look at the middle of the 19th century, for example. Think about chemistry that was done in small labs and how chemistry evolved into chemical engineering. The fact that we wanted to scale processes and to create those huge chemical plants that could explode and kill 1,000 people if things go wrong, forced the engineering profession to develop a whole set of safety standards and practices that are taught from the very first year you study engineering. And I think we will come up with the same set of practices for AI.
So do you believe in the Hippocratic Oath equivalent for data scientists?
I believe there should be one.
You know, I'll jump in here and react to another thing that you said, talking about the talent. And I think that it is critical that we remember that AI doesn't operate in a vacuum. We saw a really interesting instance of a financial institution that was using AI around automating aspects of their claims processing systems, and in which agents were using it to automate aspects of the process, but they were invited to comment on that. And the curious thing was that those agents who were lower rated in terms of their performance had a tendency, quite logically if you think about it, to add a lot more commentary in. They felt a need to demonstrate their value, but that commentary was part of the learning loop of the system. And so if you step back, you can see an instance in which an individual's discomfort with the AI disrupting the way in which they've been doing their work over time erodes the quality and the accuracy of that AI. And so I think we need to think about governance in a holistic way, and about how you get that fusion between the individual and the machine, and you ensure that it's effective.
Great. That actually leads us to our last question. I'm sure that many of you have heard, but MAS, in collaboration with the financial industry, have released their FEED guidelines, and that is fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. Now, luckily for us, we have our resident FEED champion, which is Shameek. And what I'm going to ask you for is, what is your top principle, and how does that relate to the work that you do? How would that come into practice?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit and not talk about one principle. There are 14, and frankly...
No.
I will probably not talk about one principle. I talk about three interesting discussions that went into three of the principles. The first was the definition of who it applies to. Very importantly, these principles don't apply just to banks or insurers. They apply to anybody who either develops a solution that is used by a financial service organization or is a technology company that is now expanding into financial services. So that I thought was a very important principle. It's not there in the 14 principles. It's there as a meta principle, which is it applies to anyone who offers financial services, right? So that's number one. That one we got our way in as part of our level playing field attempts. The second one, which I'm not sure where we finally left it, but there's a really interesting question about how much transparency and explainability should there be in AI. So there are a set of principles around being very transparent with customers if they want to know what data was used and how the algorithm came up with the answer. And there was a genuine concern that actually how much is too much, and also just giving information to somebody who wants to understand how it works. Is that enough? Will we even be able to explain all AI? And also, does it lead to unintended outcomes where people are gaming the system by knowing how the algorithm works? So that was a second one around the transparency. And lastly, the one that it appears we didn't win, but initially we said we should not hold the AI to a higher standard than humans. Unfortunately, I think the final principle 5 is it should be at least held to the same standards as humans. But that was a big area of debate, whether AI should be held to higher standards. At least equal is where we ended up. I think initially we said cannot be more than humans. So those, I think, are three interesting things within the 14 principles. More broadly, to your question, how are we going about it? We are, at the moment, relatively comfortable that, not just us, actually, the other banks in the room as well, that we should be able to adapt our existing risk frameworks, particularly around model risk validation, around data quality, data privacy, and around conduct and ethics more broadly. We should be able to adapt them and tweak them as needed for AI rather than having to build something brand new.
I think that for Shameek, he's so excited about feet that to pick a favorite principle would be like to pick a favorite child. But I have no compunction about picking my favorite of Shameek's children rather, which is, for me, number 2, and that is that there should be a clear rationale for why data is being used. And I think it's really an important one because I think we're in an environment right now where increasingly the analytic capabilities of AI are becoming democratized. They're becoming easily available. And particularly if you look at things like credit adjudication, an area in which like we've already seen today, there's an enormous amount of risk. It can be pretty easy to sort of roll out a model and pretty tempting to start just, shoving as much data as you can into it. I've heard that data is the new oil. I've heard that data is the new gold. Whichever one it is, more of it must be better. Let's shove it in, and hopefully we get a really accurate system out the other side. That's exactly how you get the type of problems that we've talked about today in terms of disparate impact, in terms of unintended bias, in terms of exclusion from the financial system. And so I think there needs to be a clear theory of the case about why it is that a particular piece of data needs to be put in. There needs to be an examination to make sure that we understand when that data may be a proxy for something else like ethnicity or age or race, and we need to have a really tight set of controls and governance and audits that are built around that, not just put as much in as you can.
So my own principle, I would say, is more a master principle. It's principle number 5, which reads as follows: the use of AI and data analytics is aligned with the firm's ethical standards, values, and codes of conduct. So it really is about saying AI should be a good representative of you as a human agent. And if you make decisions that impact others in the world, the AI should, as a good agent, should try to copy you. And to me, this is a good master principle. It is one that is easy to align with. I don't know why it ended up as the number 5 on the list, but perhaps you can give us some information about that.
Perhaps you can change the ranking.
Yeah, maybe we can. No, I don't think they were ranked. But I do agree, by the way, both 2 and 5 are extremely important. I did want to finish off with one other thing, if I may, and that's one that was dropped in the last draft. If you read it originally, I'm sure David won't mind. It actually said the use of AI should not violate the law or something to that effect. And we all said, what kind of a principle is that? Obviously, it shouldn't. But I actually think that, and we did drop it finally, but I think there is an important point there, which was if we think of responsible AI or AI governance as something in its own right, then we are in trouble. Ultimately, at least for now, AI is a servant for us. It needs to be a servant to human needs. That means that if I'm a responsible person within the banking framework, it is my decision to use AI. It is my decision to go with a particular partner who is good enough to work for me. It is my decision to put in a human or not. It is my decision to put in auditors or not. And therefore, ultimately, yes, if the law is broken by the AI, it isn't somebody else's problem, Governor. It is my problem. I think that is a very important piece. It was self-obvious, so we kind of got it dropped. But I think that is a very important principle as well.
I mean, I think you kind of enshrined it in principle number 8 when it talks about accountability, that firms that are using artificial intelligence and data analytics are accountable for both internally developed systems and also externally sourced. And I think that a lot of the questions that we talked about, and specifically now with the dropping of the should not break the law, I think that there's a very important question to answer when it comes to accountability, and the fact that the FEED principles basically delineate that kind of accountability is something that we have yet to see. In many cases that discuss liability, we often really hit a wall. And the fact that it came out fairly clear that this is my problem as the human, it's not the AI, not the developers, not the external source, I think that is a very positive step towards actually being able to use AI responsibly. Almost every single level of the firm. We do have a lot of questions, but we also do not have time. So I'm going to choose a collection of my favorites. If most advising systems use similar self-learning AIs, wouldn't that lead to huge-scale herding and basically volatility? Similar for loans, where all systems would exclude the same customers.
I mean, so I'll take this. Probably have less expertise than either of you on the actual design of these systems, but I think particularly around investing, most of the time, at least the systems that we have today, aren't about individual stock picking. They're about broader allocation questions, and so I think that really you're going to see, ideally, increased customization to the individual needs of the investor, as opposed to systems that are actually intent on driving individual alpha, that is, outperformance for the individual, which I think is sort of unlikely to be delivered by these systems.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And I think a variant of that is the question as it's asked, yes, it would, all things being equal. But all things won't be equal, partly because of simple competition. If the first one happens, then there will be always a motivation for someone who comes in with something else. But partly because of what you said. If your focus is, as an organization, who should I lend to, then this will be the problem. If your focus is, how do I, in our case, expand prosperity and growth in our markets because it's good for us as well, then I think you will look at what is right for this client, and therefore the answer will not necessarily be there. Now, that's the glib answer. The real answer is there is a level of regulation and self-regulation needed to make that not happen.
And on the market perspective, this is why, as a result of the financial crisis, for example, new kinds of circuit breakers have been put in place, because there has been, during the financial crisis, instances of herding in that some hedge funds were just into the same trade, and that caused problems.
Okay, apparently there's a rave going on behind us, so I will not keep you from it. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you very much for attending our session.